Hi, I'm Olivia Dade, and this is my presentation, Big Love, Fat Representation in Romance. It's a session I originally gave at the New England chapter of the Romance Writers of America a couple years ago. I've revised it a little bit, updated it a tiny bit, and this is my version for 2020. So a little bit about myself first. I suspect some of you know me, but some of you may not. I am a romance writer, a proud romance writer. I literally don't remember the first romance I read. There was a pile inside my mother's closet, just off to the left on the floor, and she told me not to read them. So as soon as she left the house, I read them and sat on the floor and pored over these pirate-intensive romances. And I didn't always understand what was happening in all of them. I didn't know what a manhood was, why it was throbbing, but I loved them. I loved all of them from the beginning. But all of that is information that you can read in my author bio. Here's what's not in my author bio. As I was reading those books, I was already going through unmistakable puberty at the age of 6. Which is about when I was reading those books. I have polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, causes hormonal issues. So so I started going through puberty, and it's around that same time that I got fat, increasingly fat for the first time. When I'm done with this video, I will post a picture of myself from around that age on Twitter to sort of show you what I look like at that time. I'm holding a game that I got for Christmas that was about balancing things, and the slogan is literally "Weight decides your fate." So that seemed a little too on the nose not to include, so I will post that a little bit later. That time was the beginning of a lifetime of being fat, much more frequently than I was ever thinner, which would be hard enough because the world is not always kind to fat children or fat adults for that matter. But unkindness was also happening at home. My father told us that he was ashamed to be seen in public with fat people, which as a family member who was fat was not great. So all of that is to say that I, as a child and as a young adult, desperately needed to know that healthy, happy relationships were possible in general. But I also needed to know specifically that people who look like me could be loved and find happiness. But as I was growing up, I'm 43 right now. As I was growing up, there were very few depictions in romance of people who look like me, and those that existed usually hurt or disappointed me. They involved the heroine, and at that time, it was pretty much always the female main character. I did not find at the time any fat male main characters in romance. So it involved the heroine losing weight or dieting or disparaging herself in some fashion for her size and discussing it continually. Like it had to be a big issue in the book, that she couldn't just be fat. It had to be part of the plot or part of the theme or the conflict inherent in the book, as if discussing it or losing weight was the price of love, that was what made you worthy of a happy relationship. Either a commitment to become smaller or the wisdom to know that that was a serious flaw, that your size was a serious flaw that needed to be acknowledged repeatedly. All the books at that time had titles that reaffirmed how central fatness was to the story, if a fat main character was included. So we have books like A Whole Lot of Woman, from 1985, I think, Just Desserts, which was from sometime around then too. From 2000, A Whole Lot to Love. So even the titles were very much emphasizing that if there was going to be a fat main character, it was going to be central to the book. But I still hoarded those books. As you can tell, I still own them because at least in those stories, I saw myself, even if I saw myself only in a very distorted, painful way, on the page. I still search for books, for romances with fat main characters, searching for myself. And so here I am, over 30 years later, almost 40 years later, a fat girl who became a fat woman, the survivor of a stint of disordered eating and overexercising. And I'm here to tell you that what you write matters, for better or worse. Romances gave me hope that I would one day find someone who would love me and we would live happily ever after. They made me unwilling to settle for less than anything than someone who would adore me and treat me with respect and affection. Romances also told me that to find that person, I should probably drop a few pounds, or at least want to do so. And they also told me lots of other things that we're going to talk about, that I'm going to talk about. So if you get nothing else out of this discussion, and I hope you'll get lots out of the discussion, I hope you keep the girl I was, baby me, baby Olivia, in mind as a reminder that whether you include fat characters in your stories matters, as does how you treat fatness in your books. There are vulnerable people out there, not just kids like I was, but men and women and people of all genders who are struggling with disordered eating or body image issues, or who just want to see themselves on the page in a way that doesn't hurt. I'm not trying to tell you what to write, and I'm not trying to make you feel bad about having written fat characters in a way that you may now realize is hurtful. But I am saying that we need to acknowledge the power of our words and use that power with kindness and thoughtfulness. So, let's talk about how that would manifest itself when it comes to writing fat characters in your books. Here's how this is going to work. First, I'm going to talk about why you should include fat characters in your books, either main characters or secondary and tertiary characters, and why getting that depiction right is so important. Then we'll talk about how to formulate a fat character, including pitfalls to avoid at all costs, and choices that can be hurtful if you're including a fat character for the first time, but that may work if you write multiple fat characters with varying experiences over time. And then finally, I'll give some other tips and thoughts to consider when you're writing about fatness or fat characters. I'm going to do my best not to look at YouTube comments for my own mental health, but if you have questions or concerns or something that you want to share, you can always find me on Twitter. My handle is @OliviaWrites, OliviaWrites, or you can email me at Olivia, OLIVIA, @oliviadade, DADE.com. So, part 1, why romance writers should include fat characters in their books. As we just discussed, the number one reason is that for readers like me, we desperately want to see ourselves in your books. But there's also an audience for it. If you look at one of the most famous romances that is often recommended when people are talking to newbies to romance, it's Bet Me by Jennifer Crusie. Now, I personally actually have some issues with the fat representation in that book, but it's a sign that larger main characters can sell books and create beloved books. From my personal experience, Teach Me, that I self-published last year, has been, I would say, the most successful book that I've written to this date. And of course, my main character, female main character, is fat, unabashedly so. And you have books like Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert, which also has a fat MC. There's also a ton of self-published, what are called BBW, Big Beautiful Woman, books that are quite popular and series that are quite popular. So there is an audience for it as well. Another reason to include fat characters is for realism. Given statistics about the average size of Americans at this point, a decision not to include fat characters, either as your main characters or secondary characters, is a decision. It's your choice not to reflect reality. A study in the International Journal of Fashion Design, Technology, and Education found that the average size of the American woman now falls between a 16 and an 18, which is the lower end of what's called plus size clothing. So if you don't include fat characters, you may want to think about why not. Maybe it's because you're not sure you could sell a book with those characters, which may be true, but it sure would be nice to try and press publishers and agents on the issue. But Talia Hibbert and I are living proof that it is possible. Maybe it's because you don't think the audience is there, although as I said, I'm not actually sure that's true. And if certain publishers argue that they can't sell bigger heroines, or heroes, or people of all genders, maybe that says more about their abilities to market non-traditional books than about whether there's an audience for those books. Also, again, bet me, and books like that, I think show that they can sell. Maybe you're not fat, and you're not sure where to start, in which case you're in the right place. Or maybe, without your thinking about it, your vision of what love and happiness looks like automatically includes thinness as a necessary component. And if that's what's happening, it may be worth interrogating that vision and changing it. I've heard a couple authors say that they always or often envision their characters as fat, but it's not obvious on the page. And I get the impulse not to make a big deal of it because fatness isn't, or it shouldn't be, a big deal. But if that fatness is not explicitly on the page, people will assume that your characters are thin because most romance characters are. And it's the default in our media of all types, and you'll be depriving people of representation that they're starved to find. So, that's why romance writers should include fat characters in their books, in my opinion. Why getting that depiction right is so important. It's part 2. It can take people out of the story if it's hurtful or hateful. I have DNF'd many books. In one case, just this past week, after the first sentence included fat shaming, when someone says something that feels like a slap against me as a fat person, I am no longer immersed in the story anymore. I'm thinking about, well, first of all, probably my hurt feelings. I may be angry. I may be trying to consider, is this enough for me to stop reading? Should I stop reading? Does this seem casual or not intended to be hurtful? If I'm thinking all those things, I am not thinking about your story. So including fat shaming in your story takes people out of that story, which is one of the things as writers we are trying not to do. Also, what you write about fatness and fat characters can shape or challenge or reaffirm prejudices about fat people, which is why you need to pay attention. Even as the depiction of fatness within society shapes you, you are shaping that depiction when you write. Your depiction also can hurt or hearten vulnerable readers. Like I said, to me, it's not just an issue of kicking me out of the book. It can also hurt my feelings, or it can give me strength when I see representation that is not harmful and I can see myself on the page. Even the representation I'd now call problematic meant the world to me. There's a reason I still have all those books. All right, so this is the easy bit. Part 3, where and how to begin formulating fat characters. Number 1, and most importantly, make sure they have interests and goals that do not revolve around food and weight, because fat people aren't only fat. That is not our entire existence. We have usually families and goals and careers, and yes, our lives don't revolve around fatness. Other than that, you write them pretty much like you would any other character, because fatness itself is not a character trait. It is not a plot. It does not mean anything but that your character consumes more calories than they burn, which does not mean that they don't exercise or eat healthily. It doesn't mean that they do exercise or eat healthily. Just like skinny people. Sometimes thin people exercise and eat healthfully, and sometimes they don't. There is no telling by looking at someone's size what they eat and whether and how they exercise. That is all. The fact that you consume more calories than you burn, that's all it means. That is literally factually all it means when you have a character that's fat. If a character is skinny, there's usually no larger implications about the character or the plot or the conflict. But when a character is fat, that's often not the case. It often becomes something central to the story or who that character is, which is, I think, unfair. So that's what I would say. I told you that was the easy bit. They're just like any other character you would write, except bigger. Okay, so now we're getting into the nitty-gritty. Part 4, pitfalls to avoid at all costs when including fat characters. Above all else, treating them as not human, like something at a zoo exhibit or a monster. And you can read this in books. Often it's shown by choice of words, such as elephantine, to describe a fat person, their leg, or another part of their body, or their body as a whole, which is comparing people literally to a zoo animal. Hairy pig is another one that I saw as a description of a fat male character who was naked. The use of the word blubber, which is in a very, 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 very well-regarded romance that is often people's favorite. And the female main character sort of gets kidnapped. I think he's her cousin. And his fatness is described as blubber at some point. But his fatness is clearly meant to indicate to up the level of grossness. And he's described, again, very much like something like a monster or something from a zoo. So, yes, treating fat characters and describing them in ways that are literally dehumanizing is something to avoid. Also, using fatness as shorthand for laziness or greed or evil. And this is often true in side characters, that if it's the one character in the book that you have described them as being bigger, like 90% of the time, they're horrible. They are lazy or greedy or evil, as I said. Even some of my favorite books have this. Also, another pitfall to avoid is making your fat characters' activities and thoughts revolve around food at all times, because we're not always thinking about food or about fatness. There is a book I read where the plot is sort of set into motion by a plane crash, and the pilot is described as fat. And basically, the main way he's characterized, until he, of course, dies of basically fatness and sets the plot into motion with the plane crash, is that he's continually eating like cheeseburgers. Like that is his main characterization, is he's fat, and naturally that means that he's continually eating and that he's going to die soon. Which brings up my next thing, which is introducing a fat character only to kill them off due to fatness, which is something that happens more than you would think. That basically the idea is, if you're trying to explain why someone dies, if you describe them as being fat, that somehow that just explains it. Well, naturally they're going to die soon if they're fat, which is enraging to a certain extent. Another pitfall to avoid is having their love interest think disparagingly of your character because of their weight, even at the beginning of the story. There is a book that starts out with the male love interests being assigned a seat next to the female main character on a plane, and she's fat, and he thinks to himself that she must smell bad because she's fat. Number one, I have never been able to get on a plane since I read that without worrying that the people around me expect me to smell bad. And it makes me a lot less comfortable being on a plane, which is a sign, again, that your words are meaningful and have an effect in real people's lives. But also, how in the world am I ever going to think of this man in the story as a worthy love interest for her? Because he's a dick. If he looks at her, and surely because she's bigger, I'm sure not as big as I am, but looks at her and thinks that she must smell because she's fat, then I don't want him as her love interest. I am no longer interested in that romance. On the flip side, another thing to avoid is fetishization of fat or fat-related body parts in a romance where that's not the point. There is erotica written for that purpose, and great, go to it. But if it's a romance rather than erotica, you don't want to make a fat person's experience of love and sex all about their weight. Enjoyment of someone's size is one thing. Obsession is another. You can objectify a character to the point where they're really no longer human. They are just their fatness. So either way, it's dehumanizing. Either you don't want someone sheerly because of their size, or you want them only because of their size. And neither one of those things is conducive to romance, to me. Related, the main character shouldn't want the fat character, despite them being fat, or only because they're fat. Finally, pitfalls to avoid at all costs is making a main character lose weight or start an exercise program to earn the other main character's notice and admiration and love. Again, if weight loss is required to earn someone's attention and love, to me, they're not a worthy love interest. And I don't want to see them have a happily ever after with another character. I don't want them to be inflicted on the other character. All right, part 5. There are choices in your writing that can be hurtful if you're including a fat character for the first time or the only time. But if you're writing multiple fat characters who have varying experiences, it might be something that could work for you. Okay, so let's talk about why this is even a category. Anytime you write one character in a marginalized group, you need to be careful, because that representation can be interpreted as representing how you feel about the entire group, or it can be interpreted as a prescriptive representation of how people from that group should be and how they should behave. So, for instance, if you depict a fat character in the midst of getting fitter or losing weight, which often happens, many romances, even if the love interest loves the main character, the fat main character, as they are and has no issue with their size, many romances include the fat main character committing to a diet or an exercise program either before the book starts or during the book or at the end. The implication, if this is your only depiction of fatness in your stories, can be that a happy ending isn't possible or complete unless your main character gets fit or gets smaller or gets quote-unquote healthier. Maybe you're concerned about setting a good example for the reader, but romance novels are not a PSA. They're not a public service announcement. You don't have to include diet or exercise because somehow otherwise people won't know the importance of good food and movement. We hear it all the time. We get it from everywhere. We don't need to use your book as sort of a training manual. Also, the research is constantly shifting about the value of losing weight when in the vast majority of cases it gets regained. Your metabolism shifts in a not great way and you often gain more weight afterwards versus trying to stay healthy whatever size you are. But that's an entirely separate talk. But my point is that what is healthy and what is not The ideas about that when it comes to fatness are shifting continually, and I don't think it's necessary in a romance anyway, because again, it's not a PSA. Romance main characters make decisions that may not be optimal all the time. Also, fat people who aren't dieting or exercising still deserve love because they're human. And being fat doesn't make them bad people or unworthy of that love. Yes, fat people do start exercise programs. Yes, fat people do lose weight all the time. And that experience should be shown on the page. But it shouldn't be the only experience shown on the page, or else it begins to seem like that's the price that if you're a fat person, you have to pay for love and happiness, and it's not. Something else that, if it's your only fat character, I would generally avoid is depicting a fat character who experiences anxiety or self-hatred because of their weight. For the same experience, for the same reason that we just talked about, it is a valid life experience, obviously. But it shouldn't be the only depiction you have of a fat person, because you don't want your books to imply, well, that's how fat people should be, or that's how all fat people are, because those aren't the messages you want to send if you don't want to hurt people. Something else that I generally try to avoid is using exact sizes or weights, particularly if you just have one fat character. Often when exact sizes are used in what are considered BBW or plus size romance, they're like a 16 or an 18, which I know that people of that size still encounter prejudice. I understand that. I've been a 16 and an 18. But I am not a 16, 18. I am bigger than that. So every time I'm excited to start one of these books, and I'm like, it's a fat main character, I can really see myself in this. And then they specify it's a size 16, and I think to myself, well, that's way smaller than I am. And suddenly it's much harder for me to see myself on the page. Now, if you have another book then where you say that someone's a size 26 and you want to show the whole range by showing multiple characters of different sizes, maybe that's okay. But I think in general, I'm not sure specifying size makes a ton of sense if you want the most people to be able to see themselves in your book. Often, too, when books specify weights for characters who theoretically are unacceptably fat or other people find them unacceptably fat, those weights are laughably low to me. So I'll look, what was it, Jude Devereux's Wishes, where she was supposed to be so fat and they gave her weight, and like I almost cried laughing at how low the weight was. So anyway, but usually you don't really include people's sizes and weights when they're thinner characters, so I'm not sure why you would do it here necessarily. And finally, something that may be fine if you have multiple fat characters, but for one, I would sort of shy away from it, is pairing one fat character with another fat character. There is nothing wrong with this, and we should see it more often, because I would say there's even more of a problem in romance with depicting fat male main characters. Fat heroes, there's even fewer of those than there are of fat female main characters. But if this is your only or your first book with a fat character, you don't want to imply that the only person who could love a fat person is another fat person. This is especially prevalent on TV, shows like Mike and Molly, This Is Us, especially when it's a fat woman involved. Fat men on TV get skinny partners, but fat women on TV usually get fat partners. And there are implications about that are not great. Now, I have a book, one of my stories, Cover Me, does have a fat female and male MCs. But again, I'd written other fat characters at that point, so I was pretty clear. I think it was pretty clear to readers that I didn't believe that the only person who could be attracted to and love a fat person is another fat person. Okay, the last main thing is part 6, which is other tips and subjects to ponder. All right, first, you should not be saying that fat women are real women and that skinny women are bitches, calling them skinny bitches. Denigrating other body types is not what we're going for here. Real women have curves. No, no. This is about accepting the entire spectrum of bodies as beautiful and desirable and worthy of love. So, celebrating or having fat characters on the page in a way that is heartening does not mean insulting people who are not fat because of their non-fatness. Using the phrase curves in all the right places. There are no wrong places to have curves, but usually when they say curves in all the right places, they're talking about breasts, particularly if you're talking about female main characters. Breasts, hips, and butt. But yeah, I've got curves other places, like my upper arm and my stomach. And you don't want to sort of imply that there are wrong places to have curves. Another thing I would avoid is including an encounter at some point in the book, and this is a lot more common than you would think, with a random naked or nearly naked fat person, and having the main character think about how gross the sight is. Now, in general, I don't want to be confronted with random naked people, no matter what their size is. But it seems to be a thing in a lot of books that you will encounter a fat naked person, and yeah, they think about how gross they are or use the ostensible grossness for comic relief, and that's hurtful. It's also just really boring. I would say, I mean, it's just been done so many times. I'm not sure why you wouldn't want to take a different spin on that. I would also avoid offhand comments about how having gained weight is a failure of some sort. It often comes up with discussion of class reunions in books, or coming back to your hometown to see people that you haven't seen for a decade or two. Wow, he'd really let himself go. Or at least she hadn't gained weight, like so many others at their reunion. This sort of depiction that, yes, that having gained weight is somehow a grave failure on their part is not great. And it's often paired with a sense of superiority on the part of the MC that's not, for me, not very charming. Also, I should note, I haven't been to any of my reunions for a variety of reasons, but one of them is because I did not want my weight to be interpreted in that way. And I'm sure that part of my fear about that comes from having read books about that, with that line of thinking. I think something else to look at is not focusing on one particular type of plus-size body to the exclusion of others. I've noticed this most particularly with female main characters, especially with hourglass bodies. Hourglass bodies are gorgeous, but they're not the only type of beautiful fat body. So many fat romances expound on the heroine's small waist. I think sometimes with the idea that that is the type of body, the type of bigger body that most people want. That if they're willing to go with a fat body, that hourglass is the most acceptable shape with a small waist. And yes, some bigger women have small waists, but many, and I would say most, don't. And people who don't should be able to see themselves on the page too, because otherwise there's an implication that there is one right type of way to be fat and many wrong types of fatness. This is also true when it comes to your size, your clothing size. No size should be unacceptable or somehow put the main character beyond the pale, beyond the point where they can deserve and evoke love and have a happy ending. Something that I think is extremely important, I want to highlight and put a star next to, is that this is very much an intersectional issue. People of color, LGBTQIA+ people, people of different classes with more or less money will have different experiences with fatness and how fatness shows up on the page. There are articles about it. One great resource for this is Corey Alexander, who's on Twitter under at TG Stone Butch. I will make sure that I link to them too when I post the link to this video on Twitter. And they are a great resource for this, particularly, I would say, with LGBTQIA plus concerns. What I'm saying today is in no way meant to be the last word on the subject. This is a conversation that's been going on to some degree for a long, long time, and there's a lot more to be said about it. And this is meant to be sort of a salvo from a very particular perspective, from a cis, mostly het, white woman from a background of relative financial privilege. So my experiences with it may be very different from others. So I think there's a lot more to be said about this from other perspectives. Another subject to ponder is whether you should focus on weight as an issue in your book or show discrimination or fat phobia or fat shaming in your story. I think something to think about is whether this is your story to tell, if you're not fat especially, or whether such a discussion or an incident fits with the rest of your story and your voice. If you write very light books that don't have hurtful incidents like that, I don't think you need to include it just because a main character in there is fat. All those problems are real. Fat phobia, fat shaming, all of that is real, but they don't have to be part of your story if you don't want it to be. And for a long time, I've always been relieved when a fat main character just gets to be a main character without their fatness taking over the story. In my early books, that was one of my goals, was to have main characters who were fat, but it was sort of incidental in most cases. I will say that it is a subplot. Fatness and fat shaming, not self-loathing because of fatness, but fat shaming in fandom and within families is something that I do have as a subplot. And spoiler alert, my book from Avon coming out in October, because I had things I wanted to say about it, but I made sure that I had plenty of books where if that's not something you want, you don't have to have fatness be even a subplot in some of my other books. I mentioned this before, but I want to highlight it, is paying close attention to the terminology used when you have or describe fat characters. Terms like obese and flab and elephantine, those sorts of words indicate a certain mindset about fat that's clinical at best, such as with obese. There is no good way to be obese. It's a very medicalized term. Or disparaging and loathing at worst. Flab is, I'm not sure, is ever used as a term for fatness in a way that isn't disparaging. Or elephantine, I mean, again, you're comparing someone to an animal. Language is emotionally loaded. It's the difference in politics between calling something chain migration and calling it family-based migration. The terminology may be describing the same thing, but it's describing it in an emotionally loaded way that would be read very differently. So if we're committed to representing fat characters thoughtfully, we need to interrogate and question terms over the course of our careers, because what's acceptable and what's hurtful may shift over time. This is a difficult topic, because even fat is a term that can hurt people. I didn't used to use it. One of the things I changed about this presentation is 2 or 3 years ago, I was more comfortable with plus size, even though I was sort of in the midst of sort of changing that. But now I use fat almost exclusively. It's a personal decision, and the term fat still does hurt some people. Another example, for instance, is plus size. That may no longer be a term of choice one day because it has implications about what's normal and what's beyond the bounds of normality. Plus size means there's normal and you're beyond that. So even that term is not entirely unloaded with certain implications. Context is key. I called myself at the beginning of this talk, I referred to myself as a fat girl that became a fat woman. And I didn't say that as a pejorative. It was a descriptor, like saying I was a brunette, or saying that I have freckles, right? That's context. Because my father also used the term fat girl. And when he said it, it was a pejorative. So using terminology and how hurtful it is changes depending on that context. Maybe you've written a self-loathing fat character in the past, hopefully along with other fat non-self-loathing characters, but still make sure you keep an eye out for pejorative or loaded terms for fatness that could hurt readers, and think hard before you use them, even if using them would be in character. Also watch out for a tendency to include a fat friend who's mostly there for laughs, whose sexuality is seen as comical in itself because they're fat, and whose existence itself is seen as funny, rather than something they've actually said or done, and a fat friend who never gets a story or a happily ever after of their own. One last thing, and this may well be the most controversial thing I'm going to say on the topic of fat representation. Being fat yourself does not give you a pass on this issue. You can still hurt other people. You may want to tell your story, and maybe that story is one of self-doubt and self-loathing because of your size. I've lived that story too at times. Like I said, I am a survivor of an eating disorder to the point where my hair was falling out. But if you tell that story, please make sure you provide a counterweight. Some sense that this is one person's experience rather than a statement about how all fat people do or should feel about their bodies. I want to hear your story. I do. But baby me, baby Olivia, and adult me would also like to see stories, of which there are still too few, where fat people accept their bodies without angst, without loathing, and without the need to make fatness a central issue in their love story. Where they're happy not despite their bodies, but without the size of their bodies in mind. Where weight, unlike in that picture from me when I was a kid, where weight does not decide their fate. Thank you so much for listening, if you did, because I know that was almost 45 minutes of just me in my face talking at you. I hope this presentation was helpful in some fashion. I'm sure that I got things here wrong. If I did, I'm so sorry. But this is from a limited perspective and a start to a conversation, or at least toward the beginning of a conversation. Take care. Love and hugs from me to you.